Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me on this live stream where we're going to be talking about how you can start a podcast for free. That's right. In the next few minutes, we're going to cover exactly how you can get started creating your own podcast for free without having to spend any money at all. But then we're also going to talk about how you can make that process easy and effective for whatever plans you have, whether that's creating a podcast for you yourself to create your own business, or if you're looking at doing that for your patients within your practice, or for other reasons, if it's just something as a hobby that you want to get started at. And we're going to cover all the various tips and tools that I've learned over the past few years in order to help you understand that. So we're going to get started, and we're going to talk about how to start a podcast for free. Let's get cracking, shall we? So in this whole session, what we are going to cover effectively is, first of all, what is a podcast? And more importantly, why you'd want to get started making one as well. There are some things we need to think about when it comes to that, and we will definitely cover that for you. We're then next going to talk about how you can record a podcast for free, as well as the various different tips and tools and stuff that you're going to need in order to be able to host that, because that's an important part of creating a podcast, as well as then sharing it wider. So what kind of things do you need to think about to make sure that you can do that effectively? I'm going to share with you my various tips and tools, like I mentioned, that I've learned over the past few years. And then specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can do this for general practice in particular and medical side of things, because there's a couple of extra rules you need to be aware of. And then finally, we'll go to our Q&A section. One thing I did want to let you know about, though, is that throughout this section, I'm going to, at the end, talk to you about a course that I've created that's going to help enhance this even further. So whilst this session is focusing on how you can create a podcast for free, there's definitely going to be times where you may want to spend a little bit of money to enhance that podcast and make it a lot more effective for you. And this guide will help you to do that. I'm going to basically have a little bit of my geeky flair. So it's a little bit Star Wars-y themed. So looking at how you can sound less like Darth Vader, more like Obi-Wan Kenobi, and definitely all the various lightsaber tools that you're going to need in order to make that more effective for you. But anyway, enough talking about that. We'll get back to that later on. First of all, what is a podcast? Well, a podcast is an audio file that you can then share across various different places. And it's really easy to do compared to other types of content creation, which can be a lot more complicated. It really is simple and easy to do. In fact, all you need to do is have a device to record with and get started from there. And that's it. It's as simple as that. The other benefit of podcasts when it comes to content creation is that it's not video. Being in front of a camera makes many people feel very anxious. And also there is an added complexity layer of having to have things like lighting, the shot, all those other kind of things involved. And that's just not the case with podcasts. It's all about the audio. It's all about the content. It's all about the message and how you're sharing that. And that's a lot easier to sort out for many people. The other real benefit of podcasts is it allows you to have a personal connection with the community that are listening to you. So in particular, how many times can you say that you've listened to somebody talk continuously for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour, longer? One of the most popular podcasts in the world is the Joe Rogan Experience, where Joe talks for up to about 4 hours in some situations, and people will listen to that entire discussion all the way through. And that level of personal connection that a podcaster can have with their community, with their audience, is something that is truly unparalleled. It does allow you to share a message, and that can be a variety of different messages, whether that's content you're creating, whether that's a business platform, or if it's educational content, trying to help people understand how to do things better. And we will talk a little bit more specifically around that for practices shortly, but it doesn't really matter what your message is, but it allows you to share that message really effectively. And it's so much more impactful when that message is of obviously benefit to the community that are listening to it. The other amazing thing about podcasts is it allows you to create what's called a reference library. So this is basically content that can last for years. This is stuff that you can refer back to at any point. You can send people to listen to. Often when it comes to a lot of my content, when people ask me questions about how to do something, I find actually if I've created something around that, I can send them the episodes so they can have a list. I'll answer their question, don't get me wrong, but then I'll also send them to the content that goes into in so much more depth. That saves me time, and that provides value to the person who wants it from that point. And over time, that'll help you develop the authority to speak on that particular topic, whether that's particular business areas you're looking at, whether that's other kind of areas. As a doctor, patients respect some of the information I share with them, and that gives me an additional authority. But then creating content for them about how to do particular things, that adds to that, and it also helps me engage trust and hopefully serve them better. So where do we start? Well, the first thing you need to think about is, what is the message that you are sharing with your community? So there's going to be people that start to listen to you, and over time you need to know what that message is that you're sharing with them. Is it a business idea? Is it about education to help them understand how to do something more effectively, or understanding the process? Or is it community engagement? You need to be clear what your message is. You need to have that aim. You need to have that purpose. And if you don't have that, it's going to get confusing. An example of that, if you're creating a podcast that talks about technology enhanced primary care and learning, and I suddenly start talking about knitting, that's going to be a bit weird for my community, because they're not going to be coming to listen to that particular topic, and then they're going to get confused and they may disengage. So it's important that you understand the message that you're trying to share and align it to the principles of what that community are going to be interested in as well, that are following you, your voice, your message. The next thing is to understand what type of podcast you're actually going to be creating. There are various different types. You can have the solo podcast, where it's just you talking, and that can be okay, but it's important to remember that listening specifically to one person talk for a long period of time, that can get a little bit less engaging. So it's important to understand how you're going to do that. Breaking it up into different types of sections is a really good way of dealing with that particular thing. More commonly, most people know the interview style podcast. So that's the type that people will see, like I said, with the Joe Rogan Experience. That's one of the common ones that myself and Andy create when we do our podcast, the EGP Learning Podcast. We interview other people to get their perspective. And it's a great way to find out specialist information in particular and share that value with your added perspective, which is nice. Additionally, you can have more discussion-based podcasts, so having a panel of people that can engage with that. Or you can go for that more educational or instructional content about how to do particular things. I've seen some really good examples for that, particularly in primary care. So people who are wanting to create a onboarding process for patients, or looking at how they can create information for new mums, for example. Really good one done by the Penny's Hill practice team. Definitely recommend having a listen to that. The next thing you need to also figure out then is time. And time is an essential part of understanding this whole process. How long is your podcast going to be? How frequently are you going to release it? And when are you going to release it as well? Releasing a podcast that goes out, about general practice, for example, that goes out on a Saturday morning may not be the best time, because actually that's not when a lot of people involved in general practice will be around. But that's important to know. Additionally, creating 2-hour-long podcasts about one's niche particular area may help some people, but for the majority, that's going to not be something they engage with for the full time. However, a discussion-based podcast that lasts potentially that length of time, that's a different matter. And then frequency is obviously something you need to consider. How often are you going to release a podcast? Most people used to enjoy having the newspapers come every single day because they knew what time was going to come, and that was their update of their information. And similarly, podcasts work exactly the same way. People want to know when your content's going to come. They kind of need to know how to expect it. So if you're releasing a podcast once every 4 months or so, chances are it's not going to click with many people, because they don't know how often you're going to be releasing, and actually it's not frequency enough to keep them engaged. How often you release a podcast is completely up to you. A lot of people will often say going for weekly is a really good standard to start for, but if you can't manage that, 2 weekly is still really good. Monthly is not bad, and particularly that's how I started off, releasing monthly just to dip my toe into it, but rapidly found that actually I got much better engagement when we moved down to 2 weekly and then to weekly as well. Going for daily, that's a challenge, I'll be honest. So if you are going for that, making sure you've got the relevant time to do so is really important, and make sure you've got set aside time to create this content is also really, really valuable. Next thing you need to figure out is your podcast name. So what are you going to call it? First thing, check to see someone else hasn't already taken the names you've got in your mind. But if you have got one particular one, look at how you can adapt that. If you haven't got a particular name that you're interested in, well, think about your podcast. What is the topic about, and how can you make that fun and interesting? And then also twin with that is the logo itself. So important thing about logos for podcasts, it's important to remember when people interact with your podcast, the main thing that makes them click on is either the title, but also the logo itself. The picture itself is what attracts many people to think, browsing my podcast thing, I'll have a listen to that. So make sure it's clear. And because they are quite small images on most people's devices, it's important that there's not too much detail in there. If there's loads of small characters and words and that kind of stuff, to be honest, they're not going to see that. So nice, big, bold characters, big images, good colors. Try and stick to only a few colors to make that easy. And that's how you can design a podcast logo. I'll put some links down below that will allow you to get some more of that information easily. And then we need to think about the equipment, and particularly the equipment you're going to need to get started. So shall we have a look at that? When we talk about the equipment, there are loads of different things you could look at to enhance and create your podcast. In fact, it's a rabbit hole that you could end up potentially spending thousands of pounds on. But we're going to be focusing on how you can do this for free. And it is absolutely possible to start and create and continue to make a podcast for free, not spending anything. Okay, you are going to need some stuff, and these are things that most people will probably have, so therefore kind of fudging it slightly there. But these are the pieces of equipment that you're going to need in order to create a podcast for free. So first up, and definitely one of the easiest ones I find for most people, is having a smartphone. Most modern smartphones, even some of the more cost-effective ones, are more than capable of creating your own podcast with just simply this device. Additionally, because phones generally have really good audio receivers in them for call quality and stuff, it does mean that their microphones are actually pretty decent most of the time. However, looking at an extra headset or microphone to enhance that can be really effective, or just simply using the attached earbuds that you get with them, the Apple earbuds in particular, the Apple Pods, they're really good quality. Alternatively, if you're not the person who wants to focus on having a smartphone, you might want to just consider using your computer. So actually, most of my podcasts are created using my Surface Pro, my laptop that I've got, and this houses everything I need to create my podcast if I wanted to. So next up, you are going to need a headset. So I mentioned this earlier. If you're going to use your phone in particular, using the buds or the headset that you get with it, that just helps to enhance the quality of the audio. But also, if you're doing particularly remote or interview-based ones, reducing the echo that you get from the other person you're speaking with, that's going to be really important. That's where having the headphones and the headset and stuff are really valuable. So it depends on which one you use, but I've got one like this. You can use proper headphones themselves or more expensive devices if you want to. But to be honest, your bog standard pair of headphones, that will work perfectly fine. Next, you are going to need somewhere quiet to record. So as you probably figured out, I'm recording this for my practice. That's just because as soon as I finish this, I'm on call for my practice. However, having somewhere nice and quiet to record is really useful. And actually, you don't need a specific studio or loads of treatment to happen in a room to make that effective. There are two quick little hacks that you can do, that anyone can do in their home, that will give you a really good place to record from. The first one is creating a blanket fort. Now, I mentioned earlier that podcasts, they can't see you, what you're doing. So actually just creating a fort with a couple of blankets on top of your bed really does help to enhance the audio quality, because it reduces a lot of the reverb and the echo that you'll get, and also the blankets will absorb a lot of the extra sound around you, so that will create a really nice podcasting environment. And it's a free way of doing it without having to worry about all the extra equipment you might want to consider. An alternative, if you don't like that particular idea, is then actually considering if you want to do it in your wardrobe. And yeah, I did actually just say your wardrobe. So if you've got a nice cupboard or something like that you can at least fit into, then having the clothes and that kind of stuff around you, particularly if you've got one of those small dressing room closets or walk-in closets and stuff, because the clothing themselves act as really good sound absorption, and that can help to improve the audio quality itself. Places to avoid, those places with hardwood floors, lots of clean walls with nothing on them, that can create a lot of echo and create a lot of background noise that can actually really be a challenge. And definitely avoid somewhere that's really loud. So if you're right next to a main road, for example, and that's where it is, and you've got lots of stuff happening in the background, that kind of thing, not ideal. Again, creating a podcast in the middle of a busy office may not be the best place to do it, because you're going to get loads of background noise that will impact the audio quality. And remember, people are engaging with this because of the audio quality itself. Next, you're going to need something to record with. So we talked about having the computer or the smartphone itself, and then you will need probably some software to do that. There are two in particular that I'm going to recommend. We'll talk about those in a second. But in particular, one of my favorite ones is a free piece of software called Audacity. So definitely have a look at that. And then you need some software to edit with. So let's have a look at those, shall we? So in terms of talking about recording for free, there are lots of options, as you can see by this demonstration. So my personal favorite, like I recommended, was Audacity. This is open source software that is free to download and use. And there's loads of really good tutorials out there that you can engage with on YouTube and various different things. And that can make recording your podcast really easy. If you're more of a Mac person, GarageBand that comes with most Macs and iPads and that kind of stuff is exactly the same. It does a really good job, an effective job. I do think Audacity pips it because you can put Audacity onto Macs and stuff. But that's a really easy way of doing things if you want to. There is a platform called Anchor, and we're going to be going back to Anchor a few times throughout this talk, and that allows you to edit your podcast. Allows you to record your podcast for free if you use that, because it enables that content. But sometimes you're going to want to record podcasts potentially with other people that aren't in the same room, and that's where you're going to need to use remote recording software in particular. Anchor allows that to happen, but other ones that you can consider are things like Zoom, that many people know how to use. You just switch record, and there you go. The slight issue with Zoom is that if you want really good audio quality, you need to switch off a lot of the background processing functions that Zoom does. And admittedly, it still compresses the sound a little bit. So the quality of that particular audio may not be the best one. Although as a free option, it's a really good way of getting started. Downside to the free Zoom is you've only got a 40-minute limit, so be cautious of that. Alternatively, you can look at a platform called Squadcast, which has amazing audio quality and does have a free part of it as well. However, that is limited, I believe, to 2 hours a month in terms of recording. So if you think you're going to hit that particular limit, you might want to use the platform that I use, which is StreamYard for my remote recording. So StreamYard is a really good platform for doing live streams. And in fact, that's how you're getting this content right now. I'm pumping it through StreamYard to come to you. And it allows me to do live streams, it allows me to do video recordings, and the audio quality is pretty good. In fact, it's much better than Zoom. Probably not as good as Squadcast, but it allows me to do everything else. And the free portion of it is really good because it has an unlimited amount that you can do for audio recording. So if you don't actually press the record button in terms of streaming it out and stuff, you've got more than enough of its free platform to record audio-based podcasts with. So it works really, really well from that point of view. And I'm a big fan of StreamYard. In terms of editing it, so you've now got your audio file. You've recorded that either yourself or you've created a podcast episode with whatever of the earlier things we mentioned, or you've done a remote recording session. You've got this audio file. Now, depending on how you want to edit that, there are different ways you can do that. You can use any of these three platforms. Don't get me wrong, there's lots more, but these are all free. So I mentioned Audacity already. I've mentioned GarageBand already. And Anchor also has the kind of option for you to edit the podcast as well inside it, adding in things like intros, outros, that kind of stuff as well. But then you've created this audio file, okay? So you've gone off, you've recorded an episode, you've edited it down. It's important to remember you don't have to over-edit it. You don't have to cut out every single and R and that kind of thing. But once you've got something that you think is a nice piece of audio quality content, you then need to push this out to other people. And in order to do that, you need a podcast host. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about what happens. So in terms of podcasts, you create an audio episode, and the people that then listen to that, your community, they engage with that through distributors. So those distributors, you've probably heard of them. They're things like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify, to name three of the biggest. There are lots more out there, but they are definitely the three biggest podcast distributors. The key reason why you don't upload them direct to the distributors is because you don't actually know where your community is listening to. Some of them may be on Apple, some of them may be on Spotify, some of them may be on some of the other platforms. So in order to help do that, you use a podcast host. So the podcast you host will use something called an RSS feed. So that's this orange little thing in the middle that some of you have probably seen the sign for, and that stands for really simple syndication feeds. And basically that's how the feed of your podcast content goes out to all the distributors. And you need to create that and send it up. And that's what the host will do for you. You could go off and do it yourself on your own server and that kind of thing. And if you've got the tech know-how to do that, great, go for it. It's a really good way of doing things. However, the majority of people probably won't have that technology know-how or the time to invest in learning how to do that. So having a host do that for you works really well. There are different types of hosts. You can either go for ones that are completely free, or that you can go for ones which have the freemium policy. So part of it is free, but if you want extra functions, you will have to pay for it. I think with that, which one you choose, well, we'll talk about that in a second. But it's important to understand the functions that are key to you. If you simply just want a podcast host to put out your podcast, the free ones will definitely be more than enough for you. If you want ones that do lots of extra things, like help you do the editing, that help add in extra functions for advertising, that kind of stuff, then you're probably going to need to think about a paid host and stuff. When you do upload them, you are going to need to look at your logo. So one thing to remember, for the logo itself, you are going to need to create an image, as I mentioned earlier, that's easy to look at and doesn't look too bad when it's really, really small, but also it needs to be in particular dimensions. And the industry standard is 1400 by 1400 pixels up to 3000 by 3000 pixels. And specifically, that's the type that you will need to upload when you're putting them onto Apple Podcasts, which is the largest distributor at present. Although, to be honest, the other two are catching up really quickly. The other thing to then remember is what kind of category your podcast is going to sit under. Most of these podcast distributors will allocate one category for your podcast, and understanding where you're going to fit that in. So again, our earlier example, you're not going to put a tech podcast under the section for knitting because, well, to be honest, people looking at knitting are unlikely to want to know about tech specifically. They may have a dual interest, but you don't really want to bank on that, do you? You want people that are interested in tech to find your podcast under the tech section. So making sure you fit that in terms of what category it looks at. So I mentioned earlier about looking at your different hosts. And since we're talking about hosting for free, the one I would absolutely recommend you consider is Anchor. Anchor is an amazing host and it does loads of functions for free. It's now actually owned by Spotify, so there's a collaboration there. So pumping it out then to all the other platforms like Spotify, like Apple Podcasts, like Google Podcasts, and most of the others are really easy to do with just one simple click once you've engaged with the platform. And as I said, it allows you to do so many of the other functions we've already talked about. So you can actually record your podcasts on Anchor directly. You can do that either through the phone app, or you can do that through the PC, through the browser interface. You can edit it, so it'll allow you to add in intros, outros, so the starting bit of the podcast, the end bit of the podcast, all that kind of stuff. And as well, it'll allow you to basically push it out to your audience as much as you want. And it does it really easily. There are loads of really good quality videos that show you how to use Anchor effectively and even do the simplest of things like editing the information and stuff. So definitely consider that. So you've done and gone and created your podcast. Awesome. It's there for you. What are you going to do next? Well, you need to share that podcast then, don't you? You need to publicize it. You need to get it out to people. You could just stick that on your website, practice website, personal website, whatever you want to do, and kind of hope people come across and find it. That may take a while, unless you've got an amazing following and that kind of stuff. So you're probably going to need to think about getting onto other places to help share that information. The best way to share a podcast is to go through other podcasters. So the person that's most likely to listen to a podcast is someone who's already listening to another podcast because they're already engaged with that method of understanding content and they're always looking for potentially other podcasts to listen to. So guest hosting on other people's podcasts around the same area can be a really effective way of sharing your podcast with other people. And that's why often you'll see certain people on one podcast and then on another that's in the same area. It's a great way of sharing content. And it's a great way of learning about the industry and the mechanism of creating podcasts. And it's kind of fun, to be honest. Alternately, if you've got an emailing list or a newsletter, that's absolutely a great place to share your podcasts. A lot of the podcasting hosts will allow you to create a small piece of what we call embedded code that you can stick onto your electronic newsletters or send out in an email so that people can engage with it without even having to download a podcast player or anything else, which is a really nice way of sharing your content. But also email is a great way of engaging with people, generally speaking. Obviously, social media is a real option in terms of sharing content as well. And many people will probably be thinking about that as the first place to go. It's important to remember social media can be really effective at helping to share your podcast. But it's important to remember that not all social media networks are the same. You know, if you're looking to share a particular podcast, for example, with the younger generation, you might not find as much traction with platforms like Facebook and that kind of stuff. However, if you look at Instagram or TikTok, actually, you may get much better traction. But then does your content fit that kind of market? That's the important thing to think about. What I would absolutely recommend if you are thinking about social media is pick one where your audience is likely to be. So, for example, for my content in terms of technology enhanced primary care and learning, I would probably focus most of my content to the two platforms of Facebook and Twitter, because that's where majority of my listeners, other GPs, are likely to be engaging with. Yes, more are increasingly going to things like Instagram and other kind of platforms, but there's not a big mass of them yet. So actually focusing on the platforms I know where my community is likely to be, that's more important to me and also to my listeners. Similarly, if it's for your practice, if you're trying to capture the intention of like I said, the 60 to 80-year-olds, going to TikTok may not be the best option for you. Have a think about where your audience is likely to live and then go to those particular platforms, and also use one that you actually engage with. As much as Instagram is a growing platform, I must admit, I'm not a big fan of it. I find it really hard to engage with. You compare that to other platforms like Clubhouse, which is the new kid on the block, an audio engaging platform. Actually, that's the opportunity to talk and engage with people. It's really fun, really addictive. So be cautious of that, though. You don't want to go down the rabbit hole. So I'm going to give you a couple of quick tools and tips that may help to enhance the way that you create your podcast right now. So I call this my sonic toolbox, my whole DrGandalf persona and everything. And these 4 platforms in particular will really supercharge the way that you create and share your podcast. I mentioned earlier about all the images that you may need to create. So things like your logos, and particularly if you want to create other additional things like thumbnails for your episodes or checklists and that kind of stuff, then Canva is a nice and easy platform to use. It is literally click point, and it's completely free. You don't have to spend any money. And the great thing about Canva is it also has a massive library of free images that you can use to create those content. So then you're not being caught foul of things like copyright rules and that kind of stuff in terms of what you're creating. With doing a lot of this, I've mentioned a few different places you're going to need to engage with. You're going to have your podcast host. You're going to have the distributors, the accounts for those. You're going to have potentially Canva accounts and other kind of things. So you're going to need somewhere to store all this information and remembering the passwords for all of these different things. So using a password manager like LastPass absolutely is an easy way of making this process a lot easier. To be honest, I recommend anyone has a password manager nowadays in our modern society, and especially if you work in the NHS. But absolutely, when you're podcasting, it's a great tool to have and will save you a lot of stress and not have to worry about the podcasts themselves. Next up, we've got 2 that are a little bit more niche, but definitely worth looking at. So Chartable is a great little website that creates a single feed link for your podcast. What that means is that you can then create a web link that you can then share about your podcast itself. And then when the user clicks on that, rather than being directed to just Apple Podcasts or just the Podbean page or other kind of pages that you engage with, that person will then get the option of choosing which platform they engage with the podcast on. Why is that important? Well, as I mentioned earlier, that Apple Podcasts is one of the largest distributors in the world. But what do you do for Android users who don't use Apple Podcasts? How are they going to engage with your content? They're going to have to use a different method because unfortunately you can't put Apple Podcasts on an Android phone. At least I don't think you can. So therefore you need a way for them to listen to that content. And if you just put the iTunes link to your podcast, it's a bit annoying, isn't it? So using a Chartable link that will then select for the person the preferred option they have in terms of how they engage with that podcast just helps to increase the shareability of your podcast. And if you are looking at sharing it across social media platforms, absolutely using a piece of software that helps you automate and process that effectively and easily. And my preferred option for that is a tool called Publer. I've done loads of videos about how much I enjoy using Publer. There's definitely other options out there, but the free option for Publer is absolutely enough for most people to get started with sharing their podcasts, and allows you to share to pretty much all the social media networks out there at the moment in terms of Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. It just does it, and it does it easily and effectively. And as I said, the free part of that is more than enough. If you want to pay for it, you're more than welcome to do so, but the free platform is enough for you. So we're coming towards the end. I'm just going to talk about how you can just get started in particular situations that you may find yourself in. So this is my quick kind of summary for you. So if you're a solo person that's wanting to get started for really quick and easy ways in terms of starting a podcast, this is what I would suggest you do. And don't forget, this is with the focus of it being free. So first of all, just grab your phone. Where's mine gone? Here we are. Grab your phone, grab a headset, whether that's a pair of headphones or an actual headset you might be using at work, link them up and start recording, whether you're using the recording software on your phone or whether you're using any of the other kind of things, like particularly Anchor. Anchor is a great way to do all of this, and simply using that to record with. using that to edit it with, and also using that as your distributor would be a great way to do that. You can do that really quickly and easily with your phone. And in terms of recording environment, pick your wardrobe, create a blanket fort, whatever works best for you. That's nice and simple, and you will have a podcast out and functioning potentially within a few hours if you do that. Next up, what if you're doing more detailed kind of thing? So if you want a bit more control, a bit more granular elements of how you make that podcast and looking for a bit more of a refined quality, then probably would recommend looking more using a laptop or a desktop to do that with, because it gives you additional controls, and particularly that allows you to use software like Audacity, which I mentioned earlier, is much more control in terms of how that podcast listens, sounds, and feels and everything. Again, using your wardrobe to do so, nice and easy. Don't have to think about anything complicated here or go for that blanket fort. If you are doing this for a bit more control, I'd probably suggest using a dedicated remote recording platform. So for me, I would definitely recommend StreamYard as that option if you're looking at doing this for free. And then editing it, as I mentioned earlier, with Audacity, but still pumping it out with Anchor. A couple more stages, but this will give you a lot more control in the quality and the type of podcast that you've got. And then finally, if you're focusing more on doing it as a collaborative one, well, you can do pretty much the same things. You are going to need a headset, a proper headset, I think, to make that more effective, and particularly looking at the audio side of things. And you're going to need to think about how you record it and the locations you do so, particularly for the interviews, and also thinking about the interviewees' audio as well. So a little bit more effort in terms of onboarding them, giving them information and direction as to what to think about, where they're going to be recording and that kind of stuff. Again, StreamYard's a great platform for doing the recording itself, Audacity to edit with, and then Anchor to push it out. And that's it. But what if you are considering further equipment? What if there's additional stuff you want to consider? Well, if you do want to do that, that's really easy. I mean, you might want to consider something like this, a proper microphone to enhance the audio quality. Well, if you do want to look at the additional kind of tools and tips and a bit more depth as to how to start recording your podcast, definitely feel free to have a look at the forces of podcasting. So what are the forces of podcasting? Well, this is my course that I've created to help you understand how to do podcasting so much more easier. As I said, it's got a little bit of my geeky flair in terms of the whole Star Wars theme and that kind of stuff. And it's designed to try and make you not sound like Darth Vader and hopefully sound a little bit more like Obi-Wan. I mean, he was really clear coming from the grave talking to Luke about how to do things. How awesome is that? And with that, it'll allow you to take over basically how you want to function and share your podcast across the universe, to be honest. I'm a really big fan of this course, and I've been spending a lot of time editing it for you. And I think it's going to really help you, particularly giving you all the various different tips and tools, kind of like a lightsaber, effectively, to help you create a really functional podcast. And if you're interested in joining this course, so for those of you that are joining me live right now on the webinar, I'm giving you an offer to get this for £15 today, okay? There's an additional reason why it's so low, and that's because at the moment, just because I've been doing all the vaccination clinics and stuff, about 50% of the course is currently uploaded, and the rest of it will be up in the next 2 weeks. However, if you join later, I'm afraid that will go up to £20, and then once the 2 weeks is finished, at the end of this month, unfortunately, that cost will go up once the course is completed. So absolutely, if you want to have a look at much more detail as to how to do a podcast and to do it effectively, and also if you are interested in doing one with lots of different options in terms of how you do it, additional tools, tips, that kind of stuff, and if you found this stuff useful and you want more of it, definitely join my course there. So at this point, I'm now going to open it up to questions and comments and that kind of stuff. More than happy to answer any of the questions you may have had throughout the stream. I can see we've already got some comments from the audience and stuff, so we'll have a look at those. If you are interested in joining the course itself, that's the QR code. So simply hold your phone up and you'll be able to go straight to the course itself and sign up for it. Let's get rid of that. And I'm going to put the QR code right at the top for you in the corner, so it's still there. I think it's important to remember that for podcasts, if you are creating one from a medical perspective, there are additional features you need to recognize. If you are looking at doing it from sharing clinical information in particular, making sure your indemnity covers you for that particular part. Also making sure that you've considered the various different aspects in terms of the sensitive nature you may be engaging with patients. So, having patients come on board, that might be okay, but you need to think about the process of how that's going to work. Having potentially releases to help you understand that content that you're sharing, and obviously identifiable information, that kind of stuff. It's going to take a little bit more effort. But, that's important to recognize how you're going to do that. And I think additionally, making sure that you've considered the timing of it. So I mentioned this at the start. The time that you're going to dedicate to doing this, if you haven't carved out a specific set of time for you to actually do the podcast, then I'm afraid it's going to get quite overbearing. So having a set time, so I do most of my stuff on a Wednesday morning and then release it on the Thursday afternoon, and that works really well for me. But understanding how you're going to do that on a regular basis to keep up the continuity, to keep up that consistency of how you create that podcast is going to be really, really important. So those specific things for doctors, timing, and also indemnity, and thinking about how you're going to share that information and releases and that kind of stuff in terms of the content itself. And let's have a look at the comments and questions. So thanks to Pooja for saying thank you in terms of her comments, and also the Penny's Hill team, who I would really recommend having a listen to their podcast. And recently did an episode with them in terms of what, a podcast, how basically they got started creating their own podcast for their practice team and what that looked like. I do see, if we're talking about my medical world, PCNs, practices, ICPs, that kind of stuff, a really big part of creating and sharing information. And actually, what about onboarding patients, creating a series of podcasts that patients can engage with on the process of how to engage with the practice? It's a really nice and simple way. And like I said, definitely check out the Penny's Hill team that have already done that for their newly expecting mums to help them share the information they need to know about having a new baby in the family. What an awesome way to engage with your patients and share content that's going to be of value to them and help the practice in terms of understanding the process for them.